All right. Hi, everyone. This is This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined by Charlie Araujo from the DX Institute, as always. And this week, we've got a lot of AI news coming up.
Shocker.
I know, complete shocker, but OpenAI and Google went head-to-head against each other last week. And it makes sense because they have to get their story out before Microsoft Build and Apple WWDC and all the other developer and AI conferences that are going to come out. But they were definitely head-to-head, OpenAI and Google last week. We saw ChatGPT 4.0 versus Google's release of Astra. And it was interesting to see how they were positioning themselves. So Charlie, I'm curious what you saw there that really got your attention.
Well, probably the gamesmanship is the first thing, right? I mean, so Google obviously had their I/O conference. It's a big thing. Everyone knew it was coming. And OpenAI, 3 or 4 days in advance, announced that they had this big announcement on the eve of the Google conference. Clearly, this was an effort to upstage them and to sort of steal the spotlight. And I think it worked. I think they won this particular battle because really, if you look at it, two things. One is, and I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure Google is saying Astra is actually not going to be out until later this year. OpenAI is starting the rollout right now of ChatGPT 4.0. So they are, in fact, not only do they announce first, but they're first to market. They sort of got that initial hoopla of because really they're very, very similar in terms of their capabilities. And so this sort of hoopla over, hey, this was cool. And frankly, they just had a better demo. I mean, I thought that they did a really good job of demonstrating what it looked like and how it could impact. If you haven't seen the full demo where they helped with math homework, I mean, there were, for me, even someone who follows this a lot, light bulbs going off going, wow, this could truly be transformative in a lot of different contexts. So, from putting my CIO or my enterprise hat on, I think that there's a huge gap still between what this means and how this then gets applied in enterprise context. But it doesn't take a huge leap to see that we can start applying this in very interesting ways with this whole visual layer. So if you weren't following along, both of these, what they really announced is these have multimodal models, which means you can, instead of having effectively multiple models that the interface would sort of sit and parse, now suddenly the model itself can understand the audio, can understand the video, and can make inferences based on that. And that is, and what the big net result of is it's much, much faster, and it maintains context because it's not model switching. And I've been using it. I've noticed the speed difference instantly. It's like it was shocking how much faster it was. So I think it's a big leap forward. I think it allows for an enterprise leader to start imagining more real world applications, because the latency was always an issue, and now that suddenly is going to start falling away, and the multimodal aspects of it start to say, hey, how do you apply this for like insurance claims, as an example, where you are automatically going to have that sort of visual layer, or et cetera. So it was impressive to me from an OpenAI perspective in particular. Google's equally impressive, but we sometimes forget Google was first, really, in almost all these areas, and to see them sort of playing catch up even on their own, when they have the show, that was sort of frustrating. It's like I sort of expected more. So for me, OpenAI definitely won this sort of head to head.
Yes, I feel like OpenAI, for better or for worse, has this very interesting mindset trying to create this artificial assistant, talking about general artificial intelligence. And whether you believe that's real or not, at the end of the day, they're trying to create more realistic AI. They understand the idea of trying to create conversational AI and tools that you can interact with. And I think that's a fundamental advantage, because it means that ChatGPT and OpenAI are always focused on trying to be more like an assistant or a tutor or a true co-pilot, someone you can actually interact with, rather than an assistant that you're simply typing words into. For OpenAI, that's just a means to an end. It is not a technical goal in and of itself. And so they've been smart in always creating these products that you are able to instantly identify as some sort of task completing thing. Whereas Google has always fallen prey to the challenge of not being able to fully productize a capability. So they have all these cool abilities that you can see. For instance, at the show at Google I/O, they had a demonstration of where they would draw something and the AI would guess what you had drawn, which is kind of a cool demo, but I don't know what I use that for in the workplace. If I draw a teddy bear on my tablet and it guesses it's a teddy bear, like that's fantastic, but what does that have to do with my work? Like I don't know. I literally can't figure out how to get from here to there. So I think there's this fundamental difference in how they are going about their work. And this is always going to be a problem for Google, because if there's one big doubt about Google, it is whether they will keep products alive. Unless a product literally has 100 million users, Google is willing to throw it into the fire, no matter how beloved, how highly ranked, and how best in class it might be. And it's hard to figure out what Google is going to commit to. So I think Google still faces that challenge, both in AI and in other enterprise products, and they didn't answer that with Google I/O.
Well, and I think, Google's challenge has always been that they've never really had a revenue model other than advertising driven by search. And so it makes you need that kind of scale to generate revenue in that way. And I think that's always been a gap. I think that there are two big other takeaways from, from my point of view as I look at this. One, it makes Microsoft look really, really smart, right? Because it allows Microsoft and OpenAI partnership to say OpenAI is going and just pushing the envelope at pace, which is remarkable if you think about it, at pace with someone like Google, right? Leading the pace, arguably, despite the resource difference. And Microsoft is able to sit there and bring that sort of enterprise view and the operationalization of it for the enterprise use cases. And that's a super, super powerful combination that I think is going to be really interesting as this continues to play out. The other big thing, everyone sort of, there's a lot of speculation when OpenAI announced that they were going to have this, that it was going to be related to them releasing a search product that was going to preemptively compete with Google or compete with Perplexity AI. And they did not do that. They sort of stuck to their knitting, as you said, of the assistant angle. And what, again, sort of remarkable, while Google did introduce some innovation around AI search, it was not nearly it wasn't the Perplexity killer. It wasn't, anything that was truly remarkable in that regard. And so, yeah, it was just it was this really sort of interesting dynamic that played out last week.
Yes, and the other side of this is that Google has been moving slowly in bringing AI to market. I assume there's a lot of risk and governance issues associated with that. They care about being publicly traded, and of course, all of the issues that can come into play. And of course, the European Union is always out to get Google whenever possible. So they have to be careful for obvious reasons. OpenAI, on the other hand, seems to be launching quickly. In fact, so quickly that also last week, under the radar, it seems that a lot of OpenAI's risk people seem to have left, and their internal risk team was torn apart or reassigned to other departments. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to have risk distributed as a function throughout your organization. And if that's what OpenAI has done, that's fine. But there is a part of me that says that OpenAI thinks that OpenAI has been very aggressive. Sam Altman is not known for being shy to move forward. And part of me wonders whether this is the end of emphasizing risk management in AI, with OpenAI basically saying, nope, we don't have that team anymore.
Yeah, it was not surprising by any stretch. I think that they, the entire original nonprofit mission of OpenAI has long sort of flown the coop. but I also think so I mean, I agree with you. And I think we've been talking a lot about governance. I know when I was at the event just a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with the CIO about the criticality of AI governance strategies
Mhm.
internally. I think these are all very real issues. I also think, though, this idea that we need a way to contain superintelligence is overblown. John LeCun from Meta sort of did, I think, a post on Twitter or X, whatever it's called now.
Mhm.
We're basically saying, until we can get this thing to really be smarter than a cat, I think is what he said. Maybe we don't need to be that worried about this. And so I think there was a little bit overblown nature of like, oh my gosh, this is this crazy thing. But if you had any doubts of where OpenAI is playing and positioning in the market, I think this settled it. I mean, there is, no big surprise, and I don't think any huge hit. I think at the end of the day, it's going to fall to governance, bodies within governments and within enterprises themselves to really grapple with this issue.
Yes, I do think the hype is a little overblown at this point. I've always seen AI as being very good at managing closed systems. Jeopardy is a very famous example, but Jeopardy has very specific rules and a very specific answer, very specific outputs. Things like that. And what's happening for us right now is that closed system is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's still basically a closed system. It's just that we've gotten to billions of parameters in these models at this point, managing the logic, but there's still a limit to what these systems can figure out on their own. And honestly, a lot of the risk that we have is inherent on the type of data that we put in and the types of questions that we ask at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think it's fair to say that, and again, the big existential risks, I'm not very concerned with at the moment. I think, yes, we need people looking at that, but I mean, I don't know why we would have ever believed that a company is the best organization to police themselves, right? So we need that to be external anyhow. I do think it's going to become more of an issue again for the CIO or for the enterprise as we start getting further down this road of agentic AI. And we sort of skipped over it. Google did make some additional announcements that again put all of us further down this road of agentic AI type approaches,
Mhm.
and starting to see this idea where not only is it agentic in the sense of calling other actors within the AI ecosystem, but also being able to take actual action in some way. And as we get closer to that and we start seeing that play out where we have fully automated activity, then you obviously need to be even more concerned about the governance and control aspects of it. So I mean, I don't want to say it's a non-issue. The existential part of it, which is what everyone is making, getting all wrapped up around it, I just think is overblown.
Yep. Speaking of though, so we've spoken about two of the big titans in tech. Obviously, there's another big announcement last week in that AWS, we saw there's going to be a change in leadership. And anytime you switch the person in charge of the $100 billion revenue juggernaut that is Amazon Web Services, you're going to expect some changes. So Charlie, what do you see there?
Well, so to me, this was noteworthy and significant. So Andy Jassy announced, and I guess it's taking place relatively soon, in the next couple of weeks, that Adam Selipsky, horrible with names, the current CEO, will be stepping down, and as they're calling him, an AWS lifer by the name of Matt Garman will be stepping
Yes.
into the role. What I do think is interesting about it, though, is that I've been like pretty bullish and supportive of. I thought that AWS has been striking the right pragmatically oriented notes that were very aligned to not just trying to be the first out there with all the hype, like we just talked about, right? All these announcements we just saw, cool, but are these things that are really close to the ground that an enterprise can execute on? Not really. And AWS, I think, has done a good job of doing that. But this is clearly a sign, from my perspective, that Jassy and AWS in general, or that Amazon in general, has not been happy with their position in this, right? What is notable in this whole conversation is there was nothing really from Anthropic, right? The Anthropic
Mhm.
made which is their big partner, and they made their announcement of Cloud 3 Opus a while back, and it sort of fell flat, right? It was just like another also ran. And so I do think this is clearly a sign that Amazon is concerned they're going to get left behind, and that this is a much more aggressive stance than perhaps, or represents a move towards a more aggressive stance than they have taken in the past. So we'll see how it plays out. We'll see. I'm always a little wary that big leadership changes are necessarily, the big catalyst that people think they are, but they can be. So, we'll and as you said, they're a juggernaut. So we'll see how this one plays out when he takes the helm.
Yeah, the politics of this are interesting because 3 years ago when Andy Jassy was named Amazon CEO, and he had to find a replacement for his job as AWS CEO. So he took Adam Selipsky, who had also been a longtime AWSer, but also at the time was Tableau's CEO. And he said, hey, Adam, I need you back. I need you to manage AWS. You've managed sales and marketing here for a long time, so you obviously know the company well. But I feel like the challenge there is that he was there to make sure everything kept running and nothing broke, which he obviously knew how to do. And Amazon has been, Amazon Web Services has been just fine. Obviously, still the #1 public cloud in the world. They've seen a bit of growth, some growth issues, but only because IT spend as a whole crashed last year for a variety of reasons. I think that was just a macro trend that even Amazon couldn't avoid. But I think the subtle difference between Adam Selipsky and Matt Garman is that Matt Garman has been more of a product leader at Amazon. He has been a product manager. He has been more involved with directly bringing new concepts to market. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that AWS wants to improve at overall. They know that this is going to be a very tough time over the next couple of years in terms of keeping up with customers, whereas honestly, the last few years, it was just about making sure that storage, networking, compute were available.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in fairness, 3 years ago, we lived in a different world, at least
Oh
they
yeah.
did, right? So I think it is, I don't want to say he was a bad choice. And let's remember, their numbers were up. Their numbers were super solid in their last reporting cycle. So it's really hard to look at this and go, clearly this was a move that needed to be made. But I think it's indicative of the fact that things are changing super, super fast. As we've talked about, there's this sort of AI halo that is driving cloud revenue, or at least implying that it's driving cloud revenue. I think there's a whole lot on the table. I do think it's, there's no way to discount the fact that over these last 3 years, Microsoft has absolutely seen a surge in their positioning with the Azure cloud and their relationship with OpenAI. So, I think those are all challenges that are going to have to be dealt with. But I was actually a little bit shocked. I was surprised to see the change.
I was surprised too. And part of the reason is because it's not that Adam Selipsky did a bad job. And I think this shows that although Amazon may not quite have the day zero attitude that it once had, it is still willing to make changes and say, you might be the second best person for the job, but we have a #1 choice that we would like to put in place. And that level of aggressiveness, I think, is one that not every big company has. I think Microsoft still has it, obviously bringing Satya Nadella in, inspired move. You have to be able to shake up your leadership for the right person at the right time, which is what AWS is doing here. And going back, from a topical perspective, I hate to say this about Google, but this seems to be an instinct that Google lacks in terms of being able to choose the optimal leader at the right time to run each part of the business. They have some status quo issues, and AWS is showing here that they don't have a status quo issue. And the CEO that they picked to next is obviously a good choice for where that company is right now.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting move, and I think as much as I have been bullish on AWS, to your point, this is probably a more encouraging sign than not. Sometimes I look at things like this, and to me it's a very negative, like, oh, these guys are just changing horses because they're scrambling. And this does not feel like that. This looks like a very precise move to solve or to close a gap that they are seeing emerge, even though they're not in any state of crisis. So I think it's a good thing, but it does speak to just the challenges and the volatility in the space of how tough it is, even for these large companies with massive resources, to keep going.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to the CIO's challenge. They've got to figure out uh, what moves to make at the right time. And we all have these challenges from an executive point perspective as well. And I think these challenges have been showing up in a variety of stories that we've been looking at across kind of financial AI, work management, capabilities where foundationally the way we manage technology is changing, and we're not necessarily keeping up very well. One of the things I was thinking about is this week, last week, there were two smaller shows other than Google I/O that I was tracking pretty tightly. One was Alteryx Inspire, an analytics event, as well as Planful Perform. And Planful is a planning and budgeting company. And what I found interesting is that in the planning and budgeting world, the software there keeps getting more and more detailed in terms of being able to manage demand, understand cost, to be able to track transactions on a very specific and real-time basis, and be able to provide the financial office with basically real-time understanding of where the company is at any given time. And I feel that that is a capability that is often not translating to IT budgeting and planning and forecasting. And I worry about that because although IT tends to do a good job with things like observability and real-time performance from perhaps a network perspective, IT does not do as good of a job in providing guidance from a financial perspective. And it hasn't gotten much better over the years, despite the technology that has come into place.
I was going to say, I think you're being very kind about that. It has been, I don't know if it's just the technical orientation of the folks that tend to lead IT organizations or what, but it is quite interesting to me how big of a gap this really is. There's a practice called TBM, Technology Business Management, that was championed by a company called Aptio that was recently acquired by IBM. I think they did a great job, and they got great market share, and they were very successful. But in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't like we saw this massive movement around it. And they were all about trying to capture this data and build a bill of IT. We've seen things like FinOps come up and try to get better at dealing with things like cloud management. I am hopeful that we're finally. You mentioned observability. I'm hopeful that we're finally on the cusp of these things starting to come together, where IT organizations are recognizing, and maybe because of the dynamic nature of cloud pricing and costing, that they have to do a better job of linking performance and cost and the underlying infrastructure and architecture of their systems. And so hopefully, I think we're seeing some movement. So Logic Monitor, I'm not sure if this is actually public yet. Okay, well, I think it is. I hope so. They're introducing some new services around cost optimization. There's a company that I've worked with called Galileo that does a whole bunch of work around linking cost to underlying infrastructure components. I think we're starting to see this evolve, but it is still woefully inadequate. And I would argue, the most IT organizations have little understanding of how all those numbers fit and how they link to the underlying services they're providing.
Yes, I was just talking to HPE OpsRamp earlier today, where they want to bring observability and cost management closer together. And I'm reminded of, so 20 years ago, I managed telecom bills. And the things we tended to bring together were call accounting, so we could get call-specific views of what was happening. We wanted to have some sort of network behavior information to have some idea of network performance and whether any of our network elements were being maxed out. And then we had the actual cost aspects, managing circuits and phone lines, and then being able to assign them to specific people and departments and projects and whatever. And honestly, I think that structure of IT performance, business use case, and then actual financial spend that structure hasn't actually changed all that much in terms of being a basic framework for cost management, but we've gotten away from it. And I feel like every 5 or 10 years, somebody discovers a new technology and then discovers a new way to manage the cost. So we did it with enterprise mobility. We did it with software as a service. We've done it with public cloud, where everybody suddenly says, wow, I discovered that I can optimize these costs by getting rid of zero usage capabilities. It's like, yes, just like we did 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago.
Right.
Yes. And for some reason, it takes us another 5 to 10 years after a technology starts really coming into vogue to put the same IT cost and expense and planning frameworks that we previously used for everything else, even though finance and inventory management and basic performance tracking haven't really changed.
Well, the thing that I'm sort of hopeful, so obviously what Planful is doing is sort of out of my wheelhouse. But what I do think is hopeful about what they're doing, and what I think others in the space are doing, is that I think it's, driving a deeper sense of discipline about having that granularity of cost management. And I'm hoping what that does is sort of create some downward pressure, because the big issue, frankly, has always been that IT budgets were just too hard to decipher, that people didn't understand the underlying technology. It was very difficult to link up the direct consumption of a service to the cost. Well, even if you're not fully in the public cloud, everything is going now towards more of a private cloud type model. So we're getting much more consumption orientation, even on-prem and traditional environments. And so it's getting easier and easier to do that. And I think, add in the layers of observability, they're getting much more fine-grained controls of exactly what is happening in the environment, and then add layers of AI, whether that's in the form of AI ops or other elements of it, that we can now start automating all of this. I'm very hopeful that we get to this point, because it is really hard to say you have a disciplined approach to managing the function of IT if you do not bring cost into the equation. So, I'm very hopeful that this is maybe, finally the watershed moment we've been talking about for 20 or 30 years, where we're going to cross that divide. But I guess we'll see.
Yeah. And part of the challenge there is that a lot of this management has been very manual in nature. We've had to try to hunt things down and try to track down bills or specific unit use costs, or the discount from the contract, and finding who actually signed the contract in the first place. So all sorts of things like that. But there recently, you pointed out before this chat that this company called Science Logic had an interesting post around autonomic IT, the idea that we would be able to automate a lot more of this stuff. And that feels like an interesting perspective, being able to automate a lot of what you're seeing from a transactional perspective, maybe meaning that a lot of this financial management becomes a little bit easier to track, as well as looking at observability, performance, service orders, all of that other stuff. So I'm interested in your take.
Yeah, well, it was interesting from a few different sort of points of view. I followed Science Logic for a long time. I'm a fan of their general approach. I think they've got some really good tech. To a certain extent, this was a branding exercise, meaning I think this was a blog post from their CTO that put this out there. And it's really just sort of a new term. But I like the term. I like that, because it sort of bundles together a whole bunch of things we've talked about in the past, where we've talked about blackout operations or self-healing networks and all these different things. And the basic premise is that, sort of like we were just talking about, that we may finally now be at a point where we have enough intelligence that we can apply through AI and other forms of algorithms and intelligence, that we could actually create this system that sort of takes on its own, takes its own management under its own power. And that's the idea. So, they're linking to this idea of the autonomic nervous system, which is, the thing that regulates our respiratory and our heart rate, and a lot of things, some things we can control to a degree, some things that happen automatically. But the idea is this sort of self-regulating system. And it's a sort of interesting concept if you apply it into IT, that says, hey, you have this environment that you sort of turn on, put this layer of intelligence, and it sort of runs itself. Kind of interesting. What was probably more interesting, though, is that looking at their website, it didn't seem to be linked to like an actual product announcement. So they're using some of the terminology, but I don't see them really going to market saying we can deliver this today. So there's almost like this aspirational view. It's not an entirely new concept. BMC started talking about what they call the autonomous enterprise a couple of years ago. There's been talk about this for a while, but I think can anyone bring it to fruition? Do we want it to? That's the bigger question, right? I mean, if I put myself back in the seat, would I actually trust a system to run in that way? I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure I would today.
Yeah.
So, those are some of the things.
I always am a little doubtful anytime I hear a comparison to a biological system. So I studied biochemistry in college. I have some idea of how this stuff works, even though it's been, probably 25 years since I really cracked open a textbook. But I like when I think about something like an autonomous biological system, I think of there are things that are just kind of happening in the background, much like when you turn on the power always turns on when you switch on the lights, unless something really bad happens. And then you have kind of these autonomous things that are happening, signals that you're not thinking about, your heart rate, things like that. But you also have to have the reactive systems that actually act with the outside world. Those are your alerts. Those are the rapid responses. That's what keeps you from, burning yourself when you try to put your hand in the fire, or fight or flight. All those types of things. And you have to have each of those levels basically defined at a business level or an IT level to be able to figure this out. So you might say, your base level are kind of these workloads that are mission critical, but also extremely stable, that you don't even think about. The only question is that server on, and is that power is that power actually on? Whereas I think this autonomous level starts getting a little tricky, because you have to figure out which of these things would you actually trust to automate, and how many nines are you going to put on it? The 4 nines, 5 nines, 6 nines of uptime. What level of autonomy actually goes there? Because the dirty truth is that even with our own human autonomous systems, like, we have breaks that are probably bigger than we would expect. We have little murmurs within our heartbeats that we don't like to think about, but that they do happen. And if they happened at an enterprise IT perspective, it might not be considered acceptable. Like that's the actual truth of getting to an autonomous IT.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental challenge that I've always had with the entire premise and concept is, well, I think we can probably agree that if you deploy something into operation, you don't want it to break. Okay, great. If we can have something that can remediate itself so it doesn't break, keeps operating at some stasis level, that's fine. But to say it's fully, whether you call it autonomous or whatever term you want to use, it implies a business context, because these systems don't exist just to run. Right? They exist to serve a business purpose, and that is linked to the specific goals and objectives that are dynamic, that are changing constantly. And so having this idea that you just turn it on, let it run, it sort of runs counter to the entire reason we build these things to begin with. And so, I think that it's one of those things that sounds really interesting, but I think that and I get where they're going, but I think that there's a lot of other elements. And the reality is, you've got to nail it. You've got to have a clear understanding, if you're selling into the enterprise, of what it is, what problems they're trying to solve, and what they're trying to do. And I think is a good way to sort of wrap up our conversation. We can talk about one of those that was a big miss this week. And that is that Meta finally announced that they have sunset the workplace product. And I say finally because I honestly thought it was sunset years ago. So if you're not even aware of it, this was sort of their attempt to compete with Slack or Teams, and it was basically Facebook for the enterprise, and it never got any traction. And as far as, according to the announcement, they're going to continue to use it internally, but they just never were plugged into what the enterprise really, really needed. And so I saw this news come across, and it's like, how about that? I didn't even know it was still running.
And at a time when Slack, Teams, Atlassian, all sorts of companies made hay creating the next work social network, all of those had some level of success. But yeah, Meta Workplace never went anywhere. And I think it's always been hard because Meta slash Facebook always made its money off of basically being a spy. We all know that Facebook has access to all of your data. They are unrepentant about that on the consumer side. They collect information that practically every other company, even say the Googles of the world, would consider off limits because it was just part of the model. It was just part of the business model. So trying to flip from that to suddenly say that you would be trusted in a business context was just a super hard sell. I think that was just a fundamental misalignment between the company brand and then this proposed product, which I guess technically launched, but never really got any serious market traction. I think it's important for companies to realize once you have a brand, once you make certain commitments, positive or negative, that actually does define what you can do from a product perspective. No, even if you're a Meta, even if you're a $1 trillion company, you can't just throw out whatever you want and expect people to adopt it.
And I think that is a perfect statement to end today's show with. Dead on.
Great. As always, it has been a pleasure to meet up with you and chat about this week in tech. And as always, to catch up with everything that's happening with AI, but also the challenges that the CIO is facing. So with that, if you're watching, thank you so much. Please like, please subscribe, and please honestly comment and email us with any questions you might have or any topics you want us to take on for next week. So until then, I'm Hyoun here with Charlie. Thanks a lot.